Good morning. How are y'all? Nothing like moderating a panel called Defending Democracy. That's kind of nice and light, isn't it? 8:45. I know a lot of folks in this room since we are in Atlanta, and I'm so glad y'all are here. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Jen Jordan. I'm a former state senator. I was the Democratic nominee for Attorney General in 2022, and probably most significantly for this panel was in the state Senate with Senator Elena Parent at the time that President Trump and Rudy Giuliani came down here and did the hearings. You're very familiar with that road show, right?
It happened in Arizona too. Yeah.
Right. Why don't you introduce yourself for folks?
My name is Adrian Fontes. I'm the 21st Secretary of State in Arizona, was elected in 2022. And before that, I served for 4 years as the Maricopa County Recorder, which, as you all know, it's the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, and I built the system there that was subject to the Cyber Ninja audit. So I know a little bit about the Cyber Ninjas, the Kraken legal team, one of whom has decided to run against me in my re-election bid next November, so we're going to have some fun. Thank you for having me, and I've been a New Deal guy for, I don't know, a while. I was an alum until I got back into office, so glad to be here, especially with Amanda. Yeah, thank you.
And Amanda, why don't you introduce yourself too?
Yeah, I'm Amanda Gonzalez, and I am the Clerk and Recorder in Jefferson County, Colorado, so we are just west of Denver. We are a community that is about a third Republican, a third Democrat, and a third unaffiliated. I run elections for about 430,000 voters, and prior to that, I was the executive director of Colorado Common Cause, where I wrote a number of our voting rights laws in Colorado, so wrote the law that created secure automatic voter registration at our DMVs.
So I think one of the significant things, or one of the things that I think that folks are able to really use in terms of disinformation is the fact that all of our voting laws at the state level are different in a lot of ways. And, who actually takes care of the voter rolls, who deals with registration, who runs the elections. There are folks in our state, but they have different names, right? Whether you're the recorder, right? All of those things. So I think it's kind of easy for folks kind of at this level to start kind of nitpicking in terms of disinformation. What do you think the most effective way to deal with some of that is?
Well, the truth is always the best way to do it, but I think one of the things we need to do is to be aggressive about the truth and not allow the narrative to continue to be set by the other side. In other words, when there are folks out there spreading conspiracy theories and lies, what you do is you ask them for evidence and continue to ask them for evidence and continue to focus them on the issue that they first started criticizing you with, regardless of what it is. So we need to have all of our ballots on paper, right? I think it's something north of 96% of American voters vote on paper only. So this is one of those myths. And so what the other side, the election deniers, and those folks will continue to say, well, they'll say, well, we need to have everybody voting on paper, and then you say, well, everybody already does vote on paper, and instead of arguing back, they'll move and they'll shift and they'll keep moving so what you got to do is you got to bring them back, and you got to say, hold on a second, we'll get to that, but tell me why you think people aren't voting on paper. Where did you get that information? And hold them to account. Because in this country, not unlike in the criminal justice system, as in the civil justice system, if you're making an allegation, you have the burden of proof. And we've got to have the guts to shift the burden back onto the accuser. We've got to have the burden to hold them to account for the accusation, the allegation, the conspiracy theory, the mythology, and try to get them to justify or to show any evidence for why they're making these wild and spurious claims, regardless of what they are. That's where we can be really aggressive and still be kind of curious and be pleasant at the same time. It's a very Southern thing that I've experienced. When you say bless your heart, it means something different. We don't use that really too much in Arizona, although a little bit. So that's what I think the best technique is for doing that, and it works relatively well if you can just keep bringing the conversation back to the point where they get frustrated and flustered because they don't have anything behind what they're talking about.
So one of the things that I know when we were dealing with this in the run-up to 2020, we were getting actual advice from the powers that be, whomever that is, right? Not to repeat what some of the allegations were, not to even try to refute it or rebut it, because that in and of itself serves to metastasize the disinformation, that we ourselves are then part of the misinformation machine. But that clearly was not the way we should have done it.
Well, that's a strategy of avoidance, right? Instead of coming right back with counterpunching, we would dodge, right? We don't want to give that phrase more space. Yes, we do. We want to say, why is that the way it is? You need to explain it. You're coming with the allegation. You need to explain it. And I'll give you a perfect example. In my one and only debate against my opponent, who's a J6er, when he was running for Secretary of State in 2022, he said on TV he was bringing a binder to his congressional delegation that had chock full of evidence, kind of like Mitt Romney's binder full of women. He had a binder full of evidence that showed why there was fraud in 2020. And so I just kept asking that question: where's the binder? Where's the evidence? You know, and I would make a joke out of it. I feel like I'm back in the 80s in a Wendy's commercial. Where's the beef? And that really struck, particularly when I would use it in Chamber of Commerce, more traditionally Republican audiences, right? When I'd go to Kiwanis clubs and when I'd go, and I would say, look, you all run your businesses based on facts. You run your businesses based on data. Your livelihood is about getting it right. And you're gonna let somebody make this allegation and say that they had an actual physical binder full of evidence and you can't see it? Come on. And that kind of push against directly is really effective, instead of sidestepping it and trying to move to something else, because that's actually what they're doing when they try to change the subject.
And so, Amanda, have you done the same thing in terms of when wild allegations have come up or conspiracies?
So what we've actually done is we've invited people in. As long as you're not making threats. If you have an honest question about how does this election work or what's going on, we gave more tours of our ballot processing facility in 2024 than any year before. I hate to say it, but we never had, not a single person went through the tour and they saw that everything was on paper. They saw that everything we do is in bipartisan teams. They saw that we had, chain of custody established on every ballot that came in. They'd get to the end of the tour and they're like, all right, looks okay here. But what about Georgia? Right?
Right, what about Georgia?
That's sort of to your point of that it's a constantly moving goalpost. And the reality is we are doing the right thing. We are running safe and secure elections. And their arguments about democracy isn't working isn't actually about democracy working for everybody. It's about manipulating outcomes.
Well, and I think one of the things that we realized in the hearings ad nauseum was that there's a real issue in terms of civics education and just education generally, because people would get up, it would be Joe Blow citizen saying, somebody stole my vote and let me tell you how, and you check the Secretary of State's website and it said that I had an absentee ballot that was cast. And I was like, well, did you vote early in person? Yes. Well, that's all that means. But there was just a real gap in information in terms of people even understanding how their local elections work. But I also think that is true of elected officials as well. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but a lot of elected officials have no clue even how the voting systems work. And so do y'all do any kind of education with that?
Yes, bless your hearts. No, and it is very difficult, and I think those of us who are directly involved in election administration at a variety of levels, we have our own vocabulary. But then again, as you mentioned at the top, it's different state to state. Georgia, for example, is a very top-down state. The Secretary of State does the RFPs for voting systems and voter registration systems, and then essentially gives it out to the counties and administers it that way. Arizona is exactly the opposite. Our counties will go out independently. We've got several different voting systems in Arizona that all end up reporting to the Secretary of State's office. It's much more local control. It's a strength in America, I think, that Colorado and Georgia and Arizona and everybody else has different systems because that fights off foreign interference. There's no one way to do things, so there's no one point of vulnerability. It's a weakness because of what you just mentioned. Not even the folks who know campaigns can know elections. Not even the folks who get elected can know elections because it's pretty complicated. And that's an advantage and a disadvantage in the ways that I've described. And that's one of the challenges I think we always have in this area, particularly when it comes to funding and try to explain things. And even folks in our own party sometimes will use different words for different things. And it's sort of like in the law, there are terms of art. It's a technical space. And, you know, I don't know a lot about environmental stuff. I know there's plenty of other folks who do. So I try to go to the experts, I guess is the only way to say that, particularly for this crowd.
I think it's also one of the reasons that we need to make voting as convenient for voters as possible, right? Because it is confusing. You know, it's funny, you know, I have a title of Clerk and Recorder, which sounds like somebody who makes copies. And I'm running for an office that is called Secretary, which also sounds like someone who makes copies, right? But what I'm actually doing is trying to protect democracy for all voters. And so it can be confusing. But that's one of the reasons why we should have mail ballots that automatically go to everyone. It's one of the reasons that we should have long early vote periods so that people can get their questions answered. It's one of the reasons that online voter registration should exist in every state so that if you have questions about how to engage with our democracy, it's easy to get them answered no matter where you are. And I think it's also one of the reasons that we often have voter suppression laws that are thinly disguised as election security, because election security is complicated and only the people over there understand it, right? We need to make it easy for people to understand and engage with the system no matter where they are.
So what do you think, we know kind of what was effective in 2020, right? And even to some extent in 22, but what do you think the biggest kind of areas of disinformation are that you're looking at it and you're like, this is a real problem for us, and we really need to get ready for this?
Well, we thought it was going to be artificial intelligence, generative AI. We did a whole bunch of tabletop exercises across the state. We did a lot of emergency management stuff, emergency communication, how do you distinguish real from fake? And we actually did tabletop exercises, not just with election administrators and all of the folks at our county governments and state government. We did some for law enforcement specifically across the state, and we did one for state and national media. We actually brought folks in from all over the country because we needed the media to understand the vocabulary, the systems, the process. We don't need them learning on the fly, especially when they're so time critical as what we were expecting. Turns out we didn't see a lot of that stuff. We prepared for something that didn't actually happen, and it hasn't happened yet. That's not to say 2026 won't see it. It may. But one of the outcomes from that was very, very positive. Most people don't know this, but in Arizona, and I know there were several in other states, we had 15 different bomb threats on election day at polling places and county offices across Arizona. I know Colorado had a couple, and we only had delays in one polling place for 20 minutes. Why? Because we prepared. We had those lines of communication open. We knew how to deal with issues. Who's going to talk to who if we do this or do we do that? So what we expected to happen wasn't what happened, but because we were so well prepared for it, something else happened, and we could deal with it really well.
Yeah.
So that was a good thing.
And I do work, so I'm a larger county. I have full-time year-round election staff. I have IT staff. I have cybersecurity staff. I have the folks that can help run the roundtables. That's not true even in every county in Colorado, right? Where if you're in a tiny county, you maybe have 4 staff total. And so I agree that we didn't see the kind of generative AI threats that we thought we would see in 2024. But I think what we did see that is actually a little bit more terrifying is that people don't know what truth is anymore, right? They see an image on social media and they say, oh, that's AI, when actually it's real. And I think the inability to distinguish what is real and what isn't is a real threat, because it really gets in our way of getting out accurate information about elections. we went above and beyond last year, and we continue to do it this year, about going out to community members. We had events in front of schools and laundromats and dispensaries and anywhere that would take us to say, how do we talk to real people to get accurate information out that they can trust? Because we know that they don't know what they can trust on a screen. And I think that's something that we are going to have to continue to contend with.
Well, and what advice can you give? Look, you're lucky right now because I know it won't always stay that way in Arizona, but you've got a Democratic governor, you've got a Democratic AG that you can work with. But what happens when that flips, right? And the governor is a Republican and the AG is a Republican, and then you're the Democratic Secretary of State. What advice can you give for states that are dealing with at the very top of the heap in terms of the authority and the purse strings for funding? What ways can you kind of deal with that? And maybe just to be savvy, if you know that maybe the very people that you should be working with are actually working against you.
I think there's a universal truth that, well, I'll harken back to my days in the Marine Corps, right? The 7 Ps, and they're slightly vulgar, but we're all adults here. Prior proper planning prevents piss poor performance. And it doesn't matter what the challenge is, whether or not your co-executives in government are of the same party or not. You've got to be able to look ahead and you've got to be able to plan. What's going to happen? How am I going to deal with it? Who are my allies? Who are the other folks that we need to deal with? And I think one of the things that is incredibly important in these spaces is sort of network of allies that you have that you can call and talk to, whether it's non-government organizations, different folks out there who you can call in to file, I don't know, friendly lawsuits against you that you'd have to defend that would go, these, and I'm not promoting anything unethical here, but what I am saying is it's not always bad to challenge first. It's not always bad to draw first blood. Depending on the circumstances, and it works. It sometimes works really well. I'll give you a great example. When I was the recorder in Maricopa County, we had a significant issue with our documented proof of citizenship stuff, which we've had in Arizona, by the way, for 20 years. Right? Everybody's all up in arms about the SAVE Act. If you want to know how bad it is, ask me later. But we talked to some organizations and we're like, look, these are problems that are happening in your community. Boy, it would be nice if we had some challenges so we could have some finality to clear up this law. And all of a sudden we get sued. And guess what? As the defendant, I'm at the table and I can get a settlement that might help voters. And the courts will be amenable to that sort of thing. You gotta be strategic in the way that you do things, whether you're at an advantage or a disadvantage. The really great thing about having complex systems and complex processes is that if you understand them well enough, you can use them to the advantage of your constituents. You can use them to the advantage of your voters in a whole lot of different ways. So even when you have those disadvantages, you can counter that, but you gotta plan ahead and you gotta have your allies lined up.
Well, we're going to open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions of these awesome folks that know what they're doing?
I don't think you've touched yet on what's going on in DC and the dissolution of CISA, et cetera, and how you expect that to affect state and local elections and the midterms.
Yeah, I think we have to be honest. It's terrifying and horrible, right? That these decisions that are being made in Washington have real consequences. And it is going to be up to the states and the counties to try to rebuild a lot of that infrastructure. And the reality is we cannot do all of it. A lot of what is being torn down is interstate sharing, right? It is comparing notes across state lines that will be harder to do without federal infrastructure. We will rise to the occasion. I have no doubt that, I mentioned that my county has more robust cybersecurity infrastructure than a lot of my neighboring counties. And what we do is we share that information, we share best practices, we do internal trainings. That will continue to happen, and we're going to continue to stretch election workers even thinner than we already are, and that's reality.
So the analogy that I'll give is this. The wall that we had built for years and years around election administration was protected by sort of the castle, and the drawbridge was CISA. The drawbridge has been opened, and we are wholly and completely vulnerable now to foreign interference in all of our elections across the entire United States of America in ways that most people can't even fathom. And that's real. We're working as hard as we can to counter that. But this is part and parcel, I think, of a pattern, and I've talked about this publicly. If you vote for me, you'll never have to vote again. Now let's make the systems actually less secure, which is what has happened. Now let's issue an executive order that pretends to federalize elections and cast more doubt in areas where there aren't not any issues, right? I still haven't seen any proof that there's millions of ineligible voters voting. It's just not real, right? Now you've got the SAVE Act thing. And the idea is this is part and parcel of a long-term campaign to cast doubt on systems that work very, very well, so that not only do we doubt the systems, but it's okay not to use the systems anymore. And that means we don't need elections. That's what I think the larger strategy is, and I have yet to hear a reasonable argument against that based on the evidence that is already being laid out by the Trump administration. And I'm really worried. I'm really, really worried. And like, this is my job to look at this stuff, and if you're not paying attention to it and you're not fighting back against these guys at every turn, you need to be. And we need to call on our people to call them out in the school boards, in the city councils, in the boards of commissioners. Every meeting, there's call to the public. This needs to be an issue that's important.
Hi, Councilmember Van Orney from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I just also want to say that we're not all, this isn't as destitute as we think. I did something last year, hope you'll appreciate it. I became a poll worker because I'm the incoming president for my local League of Women Voters. And so I thought, like, instead of sitting on the sidelines, why don't I go through this just to see what is their training, what's that process like? But all of us can do that. And if you haven't, I really think that you should be doing this, at least for a special election, because there aren't enough people to do this. And so to your point, talking about people being exhausted, right? You've got a bunch of retirees who, respectfully, are not great with technology, and particularly iPads that are very secure, who are trying to figure this out. Now, I was essentially working 3 times faster. You know, for every 100 they did, I did 300 check-ins. But when you do that, you can get people through the process and you can talk about it a lot. So I'm sure you're all doing this. I'd love to hear about what some of your inviting people into the process looks like. But I also think that, like, we all have a hand in too to talk about the process, as well as participating in that and seeing that from the other side of the ballot, to really understand, like, what people are going through, because I'm sure we've all gone to the polls and said, like, well, why am I fiddling around with what papers and what do I need and everything like that here? Well, if you haven't been on the other side, you don't understand, like, how complicated it can be sometimes for people to just to know what do they need to do.
So one of the main, if it's okay, one of the main things that I've started talking about, particularly in the last few months, is the difference between passive citizenship and active citizenship. Because a lot of people are like, well, I want to do something. I need to do something. Okay, become an active citizen. Well, what does that mean? That means something that I've already mentioned. Go to a school board meeting. Go to a county board of commissioners meeting. Go to a city council meeting. Go talk at call to the public. Many of us remember when the Tea Party started doing this. They were very, very organized. And they would challenge on all kinds of irrelevancies and throw all kinds of red meat up on the walls during meetings. And the elected officials started feeling this political pressure to move to the right and move to the right and move to the right. Well, guess what? That was people-powered. Now, was it performative? Was it staged? It doesn't matter. It worked. We've got people out there who need to become active citizens, and we've got a lot of people that need something to do. That's one thing. Working as a poll worker is another thing. You don't necessarily have to work as a poll worker, though. In elections, there's a lot of warehouse jobs, there's a lot of other processing jobs, and there are all kinds of other opportunities out there. So I think the general theme would be, particularly as leaders in our communities, we need to start talking about the difference between being an active citizen and being a passive citizen. A passive citizen just gleans the rewards of a free society. We go to our job, we go to church, we go to Little League, and that's it. an active citizen engages in some of the other civic discourse, civic engagement, and I think that's where we can lead.
And I also think you're exactly right. You know, I often tell people that on the days that I am feeling really bad about the doom scrolling, come into our ballot processing facility. We call them election judges in Colorado, but we hire 900 election judges every year, right? And we do everything in bipartisan teams. And if I told Fox News that I was going to send out a Democrat and a Republican in a car all day to pick up ballots out of drop boxes, they would tell me that I'm going to have a fist fight on my hands. I don't. What I have is people that talk about their grandkids and like go on walks together in the off season. It's really adorable. The other, the other thing that I will tell you is I mentioned that we did all of these community outreach events, and we were recruiting election judges. And the first question I would get is, well, if I do it, am I going to be safe? Right? Because the threats to election administrators and election workers are real. We talked about security, we talked about protections, and people signed up. We actually had 3x the number of judges sign up than what we needed, which tells me that people are prepared and willing and excited to protect their democracy. And I think that that will, for all of the concerns that I have about the deterioration at the federal level, I have faith in our communities, and I'm seeing the everyday citizens that are showing up, and I know that they will continue to do that, but it means that we also need experts at the state and local level to be prepared for anything that's going to come both in 26 and 28.
So I think we have time for one more question. Anybody has one? Oh. All right. Well, thank y'all so much. Really.